Well, good evening everybody and welcome to the Solidarity Hall. And thank you all for coming along to the annual Carmichael lecture. My name's David Peets and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Now, this is the fourth of the Laurie Carmichael lectures. It's an annual keynote lecture that the Carmichael Centre puts on. It's presented in partnership with the RMIT University's Business and Human Rights Centre. And this year the lecture will feature former Senator, the Honourable Doug Cameron, who's going to speak on the topic of Australian sovereignty and peace. Now, if you're wondering why this topic for this eminent person, you need to be aware there's a long history of trade union involvement in peace issues, and arguably the most important peace process of the past half-century, the Oslo Accords between Yasser Arafat's PLO and the Israeli PM Yitzhak Rabin, were driven by a Norwegian union researcher, Terje Ruud-Larsen, and his wife Mona Juul, who secretly facilitated the negotiations. And had Rabin not been assassinated by an opponent of the Accords 2 years later, the world would be a very different place and tens of thousands of people would still be alive today. Now, that tradition of union involvement in peace issues was also evident in the person after whom this lecture series is named, that is Laurie Carmichael. He was a significant leader in several important social movements and trade union campaigns, including the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, the 1969 general strike, the campaign for shortening working hours. He served as Victorian State Secretary of the Amalgamated Engineering Union, then was Assistant National Secretary of the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union, and then Assistant Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. And he played a central role in drafting and implementing the Prices and Incomes Accord between the ACTU and the Labor Party in the 1980s. Now, this year marks the 100th anniversary of Laurie Carmichael's birth. He passed away in 2018. The Carmichael Centre, named after him, it's a research centre aimed at continuing the legacy of his activism through continuing progressive activist research to empower Australian working people and focusing on industrial relations, social policy, manufacturing and industry policy, vocational education and international labour solidarity. And the Carmichael Centre is housed within the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute. And the Carmichael Centre operates with the support of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, the Australian Council of Trade Unions and the Australian Education Union. Now, there's some flyers on your chairs about two things. One is a book that the Carmichael Centre has just published called Solving the Crisis, edited by the eminent Lisa Heap and others. And also about a film about Laurie Carmichael, it being the 100th anniversary of his birth. We've put together a short film called Laurie Carmichael, The Legacy. It will be released very shortly and you should check it out. The details are on the flyer. Continuing with housekeeping matters, or moving on to housekeeping matters, the toilets are there. So you go out the back door and there you are. The emergency exits, where you can see them, I've got the little green person running. If there's an emergency, if Doug's fiery speech gets too fiery and the place starts to burn down, don't use the lifts, use the stairs. Now, we've also got some filming going on. That's filming the very photogenic Doug. And none of your faces, I'm sad to tell you, none of your faces will appear. It's basically audio only. And when we record the questions, it won't actually show your faces, it'll be audio only. So you don't need to be afraid of being on camera. Now I'm going to introduce, in fact I am introducing, Karina Haythorpe. She's president of the Australian Education Union, which was a founding partner in the establishment of the Carmichael Centre. She is going to say a bit more about Laurie Carmichael, and she's also going to introduce Doug. So, over to Karina.
Thank you very much, David. So just adjust that slightly. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture, and also thank you for acknowledging that we are on Woiwurrung country here tonight. So it's an honour to speak about the late Laurie Carmichael, who was a giant of our movement. Laurie believed deeply in the power of working people to transform society, and he never wavered in his conviction that education, peace and solidarity were the foundations of a fairer world. His life reminds us that the union movement is not just about negotiating for better wages and conditions, but it's about building a better, a fairer and a more peaceful society. My leadership story never had the opportunity to cross paths with Laurie personally, so I have not met him personally, but his legacy for me has been brought to life through the work that I've done with the Carmichael Centre on the advisory board and through the discussions and stories shared by my comrades there. But this legacy lives large in our movement, and particularly for our union, the AU, through his focus on skills and education. Laurie understood that vocational training, apprenticeships and lifelong learning were essential for both industry and workers, ensuring that working class people had access to education that could transform their lives. And some of the landmark reforms that we benefit from today, David has taken through, are here thanks to Laurie's strategic input. But he was also a champion of peace and international solidarity, reminding us that we must also look outward and not just inward. He was deeply involved in the peace movement, including campaigning against nuclear proliferation and to end the war in Vietnam. And he was arrested alongside his wife Val for opposing their son Laurie Jr.'s conscription. And Laurie Jr. works with us on the Carmichael Centre's advisory board. So in today's world, where every day is met with news of conflicts around the globe and international instability, Laurie's life reminds us that the championing of peace and international solidarity is union work. 10 days ago, I caught up with Saeed Izzakat, who's the General Secretary of the General Union of Palestinian Teachers. He's an incredible fighter for peace and for his people. And Saeed told me about the current state for teachers, those in Gaza and those on the West Bank. The impact of the genocide is evident every single day. We see it in the media, but the reality on the ground is far worse than the images that we see. Teachers in Palestine have not been paid for over 10 months. They can't feed their families, they have no safety, they have no shelter, and the emotional trauma that they carry is huge, all the while they are trying to provide an education for the children in their care who are living in a war zone. Last week, at the beginning of the school term, every school in Palestine was shut. All schools were shut because teachers had no pay. They couldn't provide the uniforms for their children or the food that they needed to go to school. And the impact for this, for teachers and their students, will be felt for generations to come. Laurie believed that unions must be both practical and visionary, fighting for the immediate needs of our members, but not ever losing sight of a bigger world that is worth fighting for. But honouring Laurie means more than remembering the past. It's about continuing his work in today's struggles. The challenges that workers face today, including better wages and conditions, insecure work, cost of living pressures, climate transition and peace, require exactly the kind of big, bold thinking that Laurie Carmichael embodied. And that thinking is one of the reasons that we hold this lecture, to look at building the society that we want to live in. Through work like tonight's lecture, the Centre is building the intellectual and strategic foundations for the next generation of union campaigns. This lecture in particular is an important moment in our movement's calendar. It's an opportunity to come together to honour the life and legacy of Laurie and to recommit ourselves to the values that he held dear. And tonight we are very privileged to hear from someone who carries that spirit forward. Doug Cameron is a lifelong trade unionist and a strong advocate for working people. From his early years as a fitter to his leadership as National Secretary of the AMWU, through to his work in the Australian Senate, Doug has always stood on the side of workers. Like Laurie, Doug has always understood that unions are about much more than the fight for better wages and conditions. We are about dignity, respect, about opportunity and hope. And Doug is known across our movement for his passion, for his sharp analysis, his unwavering commitment to the working class, and of course, his lilting Scottish brogue. He's always been a strong advocate for public education, and at the AU, we are particularly thankful for Doug's work as Shadow Minister for Skills and Apprenticeships. Doug was the champion for TAFE at the time when we needed him, when it was being decimated by the previous coalition government. He led important work to hold the coalition government to account, and he paved the way for the revitalisation of TAFE that is happening now under the Albanese government. Doug is always someone who has never been afraid to tell uncomfortable truths, and his leadership has inspired generations of activists, organisers and advocates. Both Laurie and Doug recognise that union activism is about building a better society where no one is left behind. It is therefore fitting that Doug is with us tonight to deliver the Laurie Carmichael lecture, because he embodies the values that Laurie fought for throughout his life: solidarity, fairness and justice. Comrades, let's welcome Doug.
Well, thanks for that. And after nearly 50 years of mass meetings and such, I need to lubricate the tonsils, I'm afraid. I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri Wirrawong people of the Kulin Nation. Can I also welcome representatives of ICANN, Labour Against War, and I noticed Sally from the ACTU was here up the back of the hall. I want to thank the Carmichael Centre and the staff who worked so hard to make this lecture possible. It's a great pleasure to have been invited here to deliver the annual Carmichael Lecture in honour of my late friend, Laurie Carmichael. Laurie was a colleague, a mentor, a working class hero, a public intellectual, a unionist, a peace activist, an educator, and a great Australian. Working class Australians have been the beneficiaries of Laurie's lifelong determination to improve education, wages, working conditions, and also by building a good society in a peaceful world. At a time when powerful domestic and international forces dominate the debate on the future of our defence capabilities, it's timely to critically analyse Australia's political and industrial capitulation to militarism and warmongering, disguised as defending Australia. Our parliamentarians have engaged in a combination of wrong-headed and dangerous political decisions with little transparency and even less accountability. The Albanese government remains deeply invested in AUKUS. The UK has dreams of a new AUKUS-class submarine at a time when its construction facilities and workforce are in decline. If the Dreamboat follows the downward trajectory of Astute and Vanguard and Dreadnought, it will never materialise. Foreign-influenced security think tanks, usually funded by defence industry companies that stand to make huge profits out of Australia's naivety, have been dedicated to justifying profligate government expenditure on nuclear-powered attack submarines, the design of which is predicated on defending against nuclear attacks by states with nuclear weapons. These submarines will lock us into the warlike activities of nuclear weapon states. This totally defeats any disarmament or arms control logic. It's a complete repudiation of decades of Australian anti-nuclear weapons policy. Labour is junking its own policy heritage. The mainstream media is determined to shape public debate in support of AUKUS, in support of militarism. Some try-hard academics spend their intellectual capital on justifying increased military expenditure at the expense of building a good society. Together, they are a great threat to our sovereignty and our peaceful existence. An example of the media's determination to attack, marginalize, and delegitimize those who seek to improve dialogue with China is the hysterical response to Bob Carr and Dan Andrews' attendance at the Chinese celebrations to mark Japan's defeat in World War II 80 years ago. The Sydney Morning Herald linked Andrews with Putin and Kim, while describing them as pariahs in the West due to the war in Ukraine and Kim's nuclear ambitions. They've never heard of the United States, these people. Andrews is the politician that the media loves to hate. He kept on winning elections. However, this tells us that the voters thought more of him than they did of the media. Something's wrong here, and it's not the voters. The conservative-aligned media seem only to know about backing losers. Surely we should be advocating for a deeper bilateral engagement with China. We cannot deal with the rise of China by ignoring it. Rather, we need to talk to China seriously and often. It would have been appropriate, and in my view in the national interest, for ministers to attend the celebration in recognition of the importance of the defeat of Japan and diplomacy in avoiding future wars. Even Tony Abbott sent a minister to previous Chinese celebrations to mark the Japanese defeat. Too many of our current parliamentarians have no experience and even less idea of the horrors inflicted on working class people when diplomacy and peace give way to war. The peoples of Palestine and Ukraine and now Qatar show us the horrors of war every day. As a child growing up in the 50s in Scotland, Aussie accent, but I'm from Scotland, I witnessed the devastation that the Second World War brought on my family, my father, and thousands of physically and mentally scarred working class returned soldiers. Many Australian families experienced similar physical and mental and addiction issues that plagued returned soldiers. It will be working class families and their communities who pay the price as mind-boggling amounts of public funds are expended on subsidising the US and UK military industrial complexes. Too many Australian politicians have capitulated to the rhetoric and myth of peace through strength and promulgated the lie that militarism and the increasingly unreliable US alliance will make us safer. History demonstrates that this is naive and partisan nonsense. The sentiments of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in his I Hate War speech of the 14th of August, 1936, should be at the front of mind of every Australian politician. Roosevelt said, and I quote, "I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing up their gassed lungs. I have seen the dead in the mud. I have seen cities destroyed. I have seen 200 limping, exhausted men come out of line, the survivors of a regiment of 1,000 that went forward 48 hours before. I have seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war. Surely we need American presidents with those sentiments. The deadly implications of militarism, war, and fear that the Nazis would develop a nuclear bomb before the US demonstrated that even politicians with a clear understanding of the agony of war will react to an arms race by sanctioning the development of nuclear weapons. Shortly after Roosevelt's death, the United States ruthlessly unleashed atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have been to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park and Museum. The Hiroshima Museum tells a bleak and horrifying story of inhumanity and the implications of nuclear war. It is a warning to those who think we should turn a blind eye to US and UK nuclear-armed submarines and bombers using Australian bases to attack China. Many security analysts have legitimate fears that military containment and confrontation of China will lead to nuclear war. I do not understand what has happened to my party, the Australian Labor Party. I do not understand why a party with a long history of anti-nuclear activism can abandon its integrity, its history, and its credibility by capitulating to militarism within 24 hours of learning about the AUKUS deal. Why would we expose our nation, our communities, to becoming nuclear targets in order to support US military adventurism in pursuit of hegemony in a war that it can never win? And even if it could win, why would we support the mega deaths such a victory would entail? Why are we abandoning the principle of peace in a desperate effort to hopefully obtain second-hand nuclear-powered submarines decades from now? These submarines are designed to attack our most important trading partner, China, in an effort to maintain US hegemony and US military superiority. Why are we pouring billions of dollars into the construction of a submarine base in Western Australia to accommodate American nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines in defiance of the long-held practice of keeping nuclear weapons off of Australian soil? Not one cabinet minister will concede this truth. The Trump regime and the US military have no compunction in asserting that the military build-up in our region is to constrain and deter China. There was no justification for the then Albanese opposition to have put their quest for the government benches before the party's long-standing opposition to nuclear weapons and its principled quest for peace. In my opinion, the Australian electorate would have supported them, whether they adopted AUKUS or not. There was no need to abandon the Labour Party's enduring principles. This was an unnecessary and politically inept capitulation. There is even less justification that, after winning government, Labour failed to critically analyse the geopolitical and economic and implications for peace of this flawed, dangerous, and increasingly uncertain madness that is AUKUS and the Force Posture Agreement. AUKUS, along with the Force Posture Agreement, diminishes our sovereignty and increases the likelihood that we will be dragged into a war with China over Taiwan. I never thought that the party of Chifley, Evatt, Whitlam, Keating, Crean, Uren, Cairns, Murphy and Evans would abandon our sovereignty to the United States. I am even more bewildered that the Labour Party, with such a massive majority in Parliament, would resort to word games about having undertaken a serious review of AUKUS and why so many of my former colleagues have been muted, intimidated and acquiescent. Where are the peace activists in the Labour caucus? More to the point, where are the local members working to look after the well-being and prosperity of their electorates while billions are poured into the pockets of weapons manufacturers, lobbyists and former politicians? Why have the ministers who once marched shoulder to shoulder with Tom Uren at Palm Sunday peace marches abandoned their principles? Why have those on the left of the party rejected common sense and long-held values to fall in line and support US hegemony and imperialism? Why have progressive parliamentarians and activists who have a history and culture of organising and campaigning and marching against US military aggression in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan and Iran lost their voice, lost their courage and lost their commitment? Why has the Left Caucus failed to uphold its historic role for peace? Why are they missing in action on AUKUS, Palestine and US support for Netanyahu? Why has the Left Caucus failed to support Keating, Carr, Evans and even Malcolm Turnbull in their opposition to AUKUS? Why are they deaf to the ever-increasing evidence that AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement are not in Australia's interest and increase the potential for devastating nuclear conflict? Why has the parliamentary left allowed themselves to be defanged and co-opted into supporting US military aggression? Caucus solidarity must never come before opposition to war, genocide, and starvation of innocent civilians in Gaza. Caucus solidarity did not prevail when the left vocally and successfully opposed the testing of MX missiles in 1985. 10 members of the left refused to support a parliamentary vote on approving MX missile testing. The Left Parliamentary Caucus used to reflect the views of the progressive rank and file. They acted as the party's conscience. Those days seem to be long gone. You would be aware that opposition to AUKUS is growing within the ALP rank and file and its branches. I was intrigued to read the Ross Gittins article of the 3rd of September in the Sydney Morning Herald, where he says, "These days, there's no great ideological divide between Labour's left and right factions. As one of the left's luminaries explained to me, these days they're just rival management teams." Surely the left leadership must see itself as more than part of the management team. Surely the left must articulate and fight for the progressive policies and the principles that the rank and file of the party who elect them to Parliament elected them there to pursue. Labour Against War, of which I am a joint patron with former Labour Minister Margaret Reynolds, has been a focus for rank and file members to discuss their concerns and opposition to AUKUS and to the Forced Posture Agreement. At the recent Victorian State Conference, delegates voted consistent with Labour Against War policy to call on the party to establish an independent parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS with full terms of reference. The conference called on the government to suspend participation in AUKUS and the funding of US shipyards pending the outcome of the inquiry. This was despite frenzied opposition to the resolutions from ministerial offices and Albo's left Praetorian Guard. Left must be in. It is dangerous when the parliamentary executive becomes increasingly out of touch with the party rank and file. This disconnect between the executive and rank and file will continue to grow as the leadership concedes our sovereignty by deeper integration into the US war machine. How crazy is it that our government ignores a basic human right to housing, champions market-based solutions and home ownership, while disregarding the lessons of the past that public housing and a housing commission is a proven solution to unaffordable housing for working class Australians. At the very time the availability of social housing is declining, under the Forced Posture Agreement, Australia is funding public housing for United States Armed Forces personnel in Western Australia. How crazy is this? It's militarism gone mad. America is attempting to build countervailing regional groups such as the Quad and AUKUS to contain China and to maintain US military and geopolitical superiority. And isn't this going well? There's Modi and Putin taking a nice stroll in Beijing with President Xi as Trump creates a world that is the antithesis of the American dream. We must ensure that we never become a United States proxy in a war with China. Look at the implications and devastation in Ukraine as the US and Europe and NATO increasingly fund the Ukrainian military. If my party were genuine in the pursuit of order, stability, and peace, we would not be funding the US and UK military-industrial complex. If we were genuine in pursuing peace, we would be increasing our diplomacy, seeking compromise and accommodations, and arguing that there can be no winners in a conflict with China that could lead to the use of weapons of mass destruction. It's time that we stop the simplistic claptrap promoted by the Labour cabinet and promulgated by its defence ministers that deterring war through strength promotes peace. While we are offering a bit of corrective therapy, it's about time that the government stopped hawking the defence industry as a job-creating programme. It's not. It's a job-swapping programme at best and a job destruction programme at worst, as investment in the arms race crowds out genuinely productive and socially beneficial manufacturing investment in areas such as modular housing, transport systems, and advanced manufacturing. We must be more sophisticated, analytical, and truthful when it comes to our relationship with the United States. The Australian government should stop claiming to be a middle power trying to uphold a rules-based international order. We are acting as a sub-imperial power upholding a US-led imperial power. A sub-imperial power is a relationship, formal or informal, in which one state effectively controls the political sovereignty of others. Australia is an active, eager participant in the US-led order. The rules-based international order that our government is so eager to promote is not an inclusive order created for the benefit of humanity. It does not mean a peaceful and harmonious system. It's about power politics by procedural means. It entrenches the power of the powerful and is designed to exclude and subdue their rivals. The global south continues to live on the edge. So when government leadership waxes lyrical about the rules-based order and the need to deter war through strength, take note of America's continued failure in that regard. Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University has closely analysed what he describes as an abiding failure of American culture. He shows that almost every modern US military intervention in the developing world has come to what he describes as rot. He said it's hard to think of an exception since the Korean War. In the 1960s and first half of the 1970s, the US fought in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, eventually withdrawing in defeat after decades of grotesque carnage. These were resounding examples of the futility of peace through strength. He references Chile in 1973. General Pinochet's murderous military junta overthrew Salvador Allende with US backing, and how the US installed dictators throughout Latin America and parts of Africa with disastrous consequences that lasted for decades. The US installed the Mobutu dictatorship in the Democratic Republic of the Congo after the CIA-backed assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961. In the 1980s, the US under Ronald Reagan ravaged Central America in proxy wars to forestall or topple leftist governments. The tradition continues with attempts to destabilize the progressive Lula government in Brazil. The Middle East, Western Asia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Libya, and the US-led Gulf War in 1992 are further examples of the futility of subjugating ourselves to militarism. It is beyond belief that our political leadership could tie us so unequivocally to the US, given its history of aggression, intervention, and destabilization that has resulted in its own humiliation and defeat. I hope the US AUKUS review saves us from ourselves. I'm not optimistic about that, given we have conceded our sovereignty, our dignity, and our safety to the Trump regime, a regime driven by an egotistical, temperamental, authoritarian, and dangerous leader. Regardless of political developments that might transpire in the future, the US seems determined to confront China using Taiwan as a tripwire to war. I never thought that the ALP National Conference delegates who expressed genuine, legitimate concerns about AUKUS would be attacked on the conference floor by a left-wing minister parroting Ronald Reagan, who at the 17th of July 1980 in the Republican National Convention, he said this, Ronald Reagan, "We know all too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they are weak. It is then that tyrants are tempted." Thank goodness we'll still get MPs like Josh Wilson in the West who stood up and argued against this nonsense. To hear a Labour minister morph into an Antipodean clone of Ronald Reagan, trumpeting strength deters war, appeasement invites conflict, is more than disappointing. It's a denial of the left's long pro-peace tradition. This is such a simplistic, stupid, and wrong-headed analysis. Warmongering is in fashion. Just last week, in a crazy act of homage to the dogs of war, Peter Hegseth was renamed Secretary for War. In May this year, Hegseth said the region, the Indo-Pacific, is America's priority, and the threat posed by China is real and potentially imminent. Well, those AUKUS submarines are going to help us if that's the case. Australia's Defence Minister described this as a very clear articulation of American intent that what they seek is peace through strength. Former comrade of mine, by the way. The spirit of Ronald Reagan is alive and well in the Labour Party cabinet. What this really means is that they seek peace by preparing for war. Just because some long-dead Roman thought it was a clever thing to say doesn't make it true. It just proves that stupidity has ancient roots. We should stop using flawed, lazy, and inept analysis and stop parroting right-wing rhetoric in defense of the indefensible. If you want peace, you should prepare for peace, not war. The Australian Defence Minister also described AUKUS as moving beyond interoperability to interchangeability and ensuring that we have the enablers in place to operate seamlessly together at speed. Against whom? China. Does anyone really believe that in these circumstances our sovereignty will be protected and Australian military chiefs will be dictating the strategy? Does anyone in my party understand that the US cannot defeat China in a conventional war? Has anyone in my party read Malcolm Fraser's 2014 book, Dangerous Allies, where he, of all people, with great foresight, articulated the contemporary issues that face our nation now in its relationship with China and the United States? Fraser argued against the Menzies formulation of depending on great and powerful friends. He preempted our current dilemma and called for a rethink of the culture of strategic dependence on the USA. He argued that the United States would not have the capabilities or the determination to defeat China, and that if Australia allied ourselves with the US, they would eventually retreat back to mainland America. We would be left defeated allies in a region dominated by China. That is provided the world is not destroyed in a nuclear Armageddon. What has happened to my party? Where is the courage to do as Simon Crean did at the National Press Club in Canberra on the 20th of March 2003, when against fierce political and media support for the invasion, he opposed John Howard sending troops to Iraq? Simon Crean gave the following assurance to the Australian people. He said this: 1, as Prime Minister, I will never allow our policy to be determined by another country. 2, I will never commit to an unnecessary war while peace is possible. 3, and I will never send Australia's young men and women to war without telling them the truth. These are enduring principles that should be adopted by the Albanese government. In addition to this, Labour should publicly declare that it is not in Australia's national interest to engage in a war with China over Taiwan. Should take urgent steps to identify alternatives to AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement. Give notice to the United States and the United Kingdom of our intention to end AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement. Ensure that we have genuine parliamentary oversight of the defence and security intelligence services. And given the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security is toothless, has no capacity to oversight defence or security activities, as in other comparable democracies, the PJCIS powers must be urgently and significantly enhanced. The Parliament should oversight, not anyone else. We should legislate for a parliamentary debate and determination prior to any declaration to have our military engage in conflict. We should establish and fund a National Peace Research Institute to operate in parallel with the Diplomatic Academy at the Department of Foreign Affairs and the National Security College at the ANU. And while we're at it, we should change the title of the ludicrously named Australian War College in the Department of Defence back to the Australian Defence College. We should conduct a parliamentary inquiry into the implications of the revolving door of former parliamentarians, advisors, public service and military personnel being employed by companies and institutions funded by or part of the global military industrial complex. Come to think of this, we should apply it to the mining industry as well. We should legislate to prescribe former parliamentarians, advisors, public servants, and military personnel for being employed by arms manufacturers for a period of 5 years after they have left the Commonwealth payroll. We should take steps to increase the density and complexity of our research, science, and manufacturing sector, with a view to improving our defence capacities and widening our industrial base. We should reduce our dependence on US military equipment and technology that can be turned off at the flick of a button by the United States. We should increase political and diplomatic engagement with Asian Pacific nations and particularly China. We should require the ABC to ensure commentators on defence issues divulge any conflict of interest, funding from or employment within the military-industrial complex. Any such conflicts would be announced prior to appearances on ABC News or current affair programmes. In conclusion, and in the Carmichael tradition, I call on Labour parliamentarians, the trade union movement, rank and file activists, and the public to educate themselves about the madness that is AUKUS. Organise against militarism, build a campaign in support of peace, diplomacy, and common sense. Let's stop the warmongering and build a good society.
Stay there. Thanks, Doug. An incredible lecture. We've got an opportunity now, about 10 minutes, I think, to take some questions from the floor, if there's anyone seeking the call. And we've got Lisa and Emma here on the microphone, so you might want to come down here, unless you've got a really loud teacher voice. We'll give it a try.
Some money into it. It needs a lot more. It's small, but it's doing many of the things that you recommended. And it's good to publicise those as well as say what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, look, I agree. And, you know, people like ICANN, Labour Against War, peace movements around the country, we should all be coming together and saying to the Albanese government, peace, not war.
Thanks, Doug. All right, anyone else seeking the call? Yes, over here. And then we'll take one from the back. Thank you.
Let me come up to the mic so everybody can hear me. I've got an equally Australian accent as Doug here. And I'm also from Lanarkshire, by the way. I guess there's one unanswered question in this whole debate is, given the history of the Labour Party and its stance on these issues, and the fact that I believe that the majority of the Australian people assumed that AUKUS was going to be kicked in a touch when Albanese was elected, why? Why are they sticking to a Scott Morrison campaign pledge? It's really confusing for me.
Equally as confusing to me. Look, I've been a member of the Labour Party since the 70s. I joined the Labour Party when I first came to Australia, just after Gough Whitlam was elected. I joined the party because it was a party that had principles and a vision for a peaceful future, a party that engaged with China, a leader who was smart enough to understand the importance of China into the future. And I think a leader also who understood what Kissinger said when he said, it may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. I hope Labour leaders have read that quote from Kissinger. So yeah, I mean, look, I've argued against this. I've lost a lot of good friends over this. They can't be that good if they can't take the debate up. I've watched with disgust as people who came up through the trade union movement are now actively out arguing for AUKUS on the basis of jobs and nothing else. Why can't we be building a new industry for modular housing with cheaper, better housing than building nuclear-powered submarines? It's my view. So I don't know the answer to that. I just know that they are locked in. There might be something we don't know. It's not that, China might be, an aggressor in the future, but that's not the history of China.
Yeah, of course.
It's not the history of China. And I think China's got enough problems in a country the size it is to maintain stability in that country without seeking to, run, this communism everywhere. I wouldn't describe China as, classic communists. But I just don't get it. Don't get me started on this. I just don't understand.
Sorry I asked, okay, thank you.
I don't understand.
We had one down the back, I think. Would you like to ask your question? Yeah.
So thank you so much. That was a very interesting talk. I'm just reflecting on something that you said, which was asking why Labour parliamentarians and caucus allowed themselves to be intimidated and silenced in relation to American-led militarization. So I guess, as I'm sure that you will agree and as you've participated in, I feel like genuine change begins with work, with kind of grassroots mobilization by the working class, right, which is often manifested as street protests. So just wondering if you could comment on Labour government's sort of increasing tendency across so-called Australia, the tendency to criminalise dissent and protest, specifically in relation to environmental and anti-fascist movements. And so, the increasing sort of police powers and arming of militarised police forces that are used against protesters and activists.
Good question.
I'll come to that, but the first comment I'll make is that we're here celebrating the Carmichael lecture and Laurie Carmichael for 100 years. Laurie Carmichael always understood that there was a limit to what you could achieve by simply taking action as a trade unionist. That's why Laurie engaged in politics, engaged in the anti-war movement, engaged in education. And I think that's been lost with some of our modern Labour politicians. And I just don't know what the sort of hold is over and I can only talk for the left of the Labour Party. I was the left convener in Parliament, in federal Parliament, for a number of years. I was put there by the union movement. And the union movement has always struggled against war because they know that the victims of war, the biggest victims, will be the working class. So, I just don't get what's going on. I don't get why we can't take more action against Netanyahu and his government. I don't get why we can't be truthful with the public that these nuclear-powered submarines are about attacking our biggest and most important trading partner. Where's the sense in this? So look, I just think that this push, for more policing against free speech is wrong. I think people are entitled to free speech. I think, we've got to recognise that some of the free speech that's out there is not what we would like, but that's life. So people should be entitled to have a point of view. They shouldn't be entitled to go out there and attack other groups or other people.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'll try and do it without the microphone. Thank you very much, Doug. It's terrific to hear everything you said. My question is it is in the Carmichael sort of tradition. Carmichael was one of the four great leaders, alongside of, if I remember correctly, Sam Altman, Jim Cairns and Joan Coxedge, who brought together the mass movement that enabled a tardy ALP to eventually make decisions that helped to end the war in Vietnam. In other words, Labor at its best was founded by a mass movement from below. This is what ICANN and IPAN and other groups are trying to build. And I think the most important thing to go with your terrific outline of policy demands is how we, in the Carmichael concept of organising people from below, bring the power so that any government of the future does what we want it to do, which is to make peace. Thank you.
Just briefly on that, and actually I had a chat to Sally earlier on. A lot of my political education, and well, most of my education after I left school came through my union, right? And you know, our union, the Metal Workers Union, which you're a member, we prided ourselves in union education and having activists, union activists that could go on the job and actually argue, analyse, and critically deal with any of the issues that fascists or, you know, Nazis on the job would bring up, crooks on the job. You know, you had highly educated political activists, even if they weren't in a political party, they were political because they could take the argument on. And I think what, you know, people talk about the legacy of Labour. Two legacies I would like Labour to deliver on is more public housing and a new a modern housing commission. And I'd like them also to fund the equivalent of what we had years ago, the Clyde Cameron College, so that rank and file union activists could get the best education possible and help fund that through the federal government. It's my view.
We have two final questions. I'll take your question first and then come to you.
I'm hoping people can hear me from behind. No, they can't.
Hand your mind, but
I'm mindful of the age of people here and the disengagement of younger people, and really that they don't engage with the Labor Party. And I see the kind of, they feel, I understand there's an age, you know, around school age 19, when we were all activists. They're much more inclined, I think, to be active, but not within the Labor Party. I'm also mindful of the diminution of the major parties and the rise of community independence, and that those people actually represent how the community thinks. I'd like to hear what comment you have on that.
Look, I'm not here arguing. Well, I don't think anyone would have said that I was here arguing that the Labour Party's got everything right and joining the Labour Party is what to do. But I have always thought, and people say to me constantly, why don't you just resign? I think there's more beneficial outcomes for people who are members of the Labour Party to voice their concerns against top-down nonsense, right? And I've always thought that, but I'm not here to argue anyone should join the Labour Party. I say join ICANN, join IPAN, join Labour Against War if you're a Labour member. Let's get these campaigns up and running, because if we don't, and we end up with a war against China, we will all pay a huge price, because there are multiple military, and which will be civilian nuclear, with civilians near them, nuclear targets, if we end up in a nuclear war with China. And we do not want that.
Thank you. Last question, please.
Wonderful speech, thank you. I think that you were talking about US influence in Australia earlier, and a piece of that puzzle that's hard to talk about for the anti-war movement, just because it makes you sound a bit crazy, is, well, ASIO, is that, Gough talked about in 1975 how there was sort of foreign influence in ASIO then, and how that was influencing Australian foreign policy, but really since then, the left hasn't had any way to confront them or talk about that. And I find that, especially with this recent report about supposedly Iran being behind attacks on Australian soil and leading us to expel their ambassador, which we haven't done to any country since World War II. And just, I'm not sure if they haven't really come up with much evidence for that. So I'm just asking, how do we talk about maybe reforming our intelligence, increasing oversight, without sounding crazy?
Well, and one of my recommendations was to make sure that there's proper parliamentary oversight. You often hear the media talk about the PJCIS, which is the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. You hear them described as the powerful PJCIS. I wouldn't even describe them as a toothless tiger, because a tiger without teeth is still a big animal. They've got nothing. And they parade around as if they are, some, overseers of the security services, some like James Bond, And it's just an absolute nonsense. I had the Parliamentary Library when I was a senator give me advice as to what the parliamentary oversight was of security and intelligence services in Britain, Canada, the UK, and even the US. And they are light years ahead of what we've got. We've got nothing. We've got an individual that's appointed by the government to be the overall, oversight. The parliamentary inquiry cannot inquire into anything the security services do. Nothing. Except, are they within their budget? That's what the PJCIS is. Are they within their budget? And it's just terrible. And you're dead right. We don't want to end up being like the US was, where they were trying to convince the rest of the world that, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, when that was a nonsense. So that, these are issues that a democracy, a well-working democracies with good parliamentary oversight should be dealing with. We don't have it in Australia. And given that Labour's got the numbers with the Greens to do this, they should do it, and they should get a proper parliamentary oversight. And they should stop doing, the Labour Party should stop doing what it did when I was in Parliament. I was never allowed to chair the Economics Committee, because what would a lefty be on there for? I was never invited to come on the PJCIS. Oh no, even though it was simply about the budget. Cameron wouldn't parade himself around there looking as if he was, M, So I just think there's a lot of problems, a lot of issues. I will say, I'd rather have a Labour government than a Liberal government any day. Any day. They've done some good things, but not enough. And if you want a legacy, the legacy should be work for peace, not for war. Scrap AUKUS and get a proper defence analysis done, such as the echidna strategy. Will cost us a lot of money, but we would not be out there threatening our biggest trading partner. Look at what we did just a couple of weeks ago. We sent, cruisers, I think they are, up to China. And Taiwan is, I think it's 90 miles off the coast of China. If there was nuclear weapons in Tasmania, and I live in Tasmania now, but if there was nuclear weapons in Tasmania, would we cop that? Would we cop it in New Zealand? Would we cop it in any of the Pacific countries? We wouldn't. And China's entitled to defense. China's entitled to defend its nation. And we should stop thinking that capitalism is the only way forward and communism is such a bad thing. The issues that the Chinese have got now is that their working class is getting better living standards. The US working class is getting deteriorating working standards. So yes, oversight of these people that are advising governments about what's happening is definitely needed.
Thank you.
I'm sorry,
Can I just say this? I'm sorry, I neglected to indicate that RMIT, because we spoke about, some work that was done in some of the universities, RMIT play a brilliant role in the Carmichael Centre, and thanks very much for all the work that you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you, everyone. I know there's a lot of other questions, but I'll invite David up to finish up for us.
I'll get out of here. There you go. Oh, you're right.
What a privilege, eh? I just want to introduce Associate Professor Jonathan Coleb. He's the Director of the Business and Human Rights Centre at RMIT, and he's going to formally thank Doug.
Thank you very much for that. I will be super quick. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Coleb. I'm the Director of RMIT's Business and Human Rights Centre, perhaps one of Doug's try-hard academics, but I hope not, based just across the road at RMIT University. We are a multidisciplinary centre aimed at developing impactful research and collaborations to improve respect for human rights amongst the corporate sector, including labour worker rights. So in that sense, there is a great deal of alignment between BRIGHT, our Business and Human Rights Centre, and the union movement. There is perhaps no bigger, more pressing human rights concern historically and today than conflict and war. So I'm absolutely rapt that our centre could partner once again with the Carmichael Centre and Centre for Future Work to make this evening happen, as we have done in past years, and long may the collaboration continue. On behalf of all of us here tonight, I'd like to extend a sincere and heartfelt thank you to you, the Honourable Doug Cameron, for offering up such a compelling and thought-provoking Laurie Carmichael lecture for 2025. Doug, your insights tonight were not only incredibly timely, but also deeply resonant with me and likely so many others in the audience and perhaps listening to this later on. In an age of turbulence, uncertainty, violence and armed conflict, it is so important to also be discussing, debating and imagining peace, sovereignty and the stability that we all seek, here at home and around the world. You've given us a great deal to consider, and the annual Carmichael Lecture Series aims to foster important public conversations. And again, I don't think there's any more important conversation than the one that you've triggered tonight. Your contribution has well and truly upheld that tradition magnificently. I also want to thank you all for joining us. Your presence and your engagement here are what makes an event like this so successful and meaningful. So one more time, all together, please join me in a very warm round of applause to thank Doug Cameron and Karina Haythorpe too for a wonderful evening of words, reflections, provocations and insights. And as we warmly applaud you both, we'll hand out a few small tokens of appreciation from us, the organisers, to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.